See, we act everywhere. Welcome. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to your Cannabis Equity Minutes with Cynthia Mompoint on this evening of June 29th, 2021. And as usual, we're going to start off the evening just talking about some data. We're still at 19 states across the country where we have cannabis legalized in some form. I think the probably most interesting update is that Mexico has moved to legalize marijuana in their country. So all of this to say that, and also Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas has made a statement about the fact that he doesn't see the reason why the federal government has any types of laws on the books for when it comes to marijuana or scheduling cannabis. So all of that to say the ground is extremely ripe for us to see legalization happen on a national level. However, what can't be lost in this conversation, and I'm going to kind of dig into it a little bit tonight, is the fact that there are still people who continue to be significantly suffer from prohibition, and even now during legalization, Black and brown folks continue to suffer disproportionately for their participation with the plant. And despite the fact that it's gone legal, we've talked about it in other episodes, despite the fact that it's gone legal in states, we see the disparity in arrest rates continue to increase. What does that mean? It means that the data shows Black and brown folk, compared to their white counterparts, Black and brown folks continue to engage with the plant in a similar fashion, at similar rates, yet the disparity between the arrests for white people versus the arrests for Black and brown people increases now that the plant is legalized. So there are certain infractions that white folks are no longer being arrested for at all, but Black and brown folks continue to be arrested. So there's a false misconception and perception within the public that to go legal means we're not going to see this injustice persist. So with that, one of the things I want to kind of dig into is looking at Massachusetts, because Massachusetts, again, is in a unique position in how they structured our legalization of the plant. Massachusetts put on the books in our legislation that we wanted to have equitable participation, and we also wanted to allow for people who have past criminal records tied to particularly low possession charges, right? Allow them to enter into this industry. Those are two measures that are that we're not seeing take traction across the country, and it's going to have an impact when we look at the legacy 10 years from now, 5 years from now, and we say at the forefront right now, as we're opening up the doors for the markets to be taxed, for the markets to be regulated, and the government to get their share, and say that we're no longer the war on drugs is no longer going to happen. This is what we're saying to the public, right? But then we're not putting in place measures to ensure that the war on drugs and the ramifications of the war on drugs don't persist. Now we have these markets opened up. A lot of them are dropping the aspect of putting this in their legislative mandates, but they are looking at social equity in the terms from the lens of policy work, right? And why does that matter? Because you can have a regulatory body enact certain policies that they're going to engage in. For instance, in Massachusetts, we have the social equity program. Now, the social equity program is not legislated per se. It is a program that our regulatory body decided they would enact, kind of because they dropped the ball when it came to what was in statute, which is our economic empowerment equity program. I've talked about that in other episodes, so please check in on that. And for tonight, I want to kind of stay focused in terms of what's happening to those who have been harmed the most, looking at it through the lens of the data that we see as businesses are opening up, what we see in terms of decision making, what we see in terms of the opportunities that are available both here in Massachusetts and across the country. So back to what I was saying, you have something like the social equity program, whatever regulatory body or board that a state erects, and this is something that people in places like New York, Virginia, Connecticut, these states where they've got it legalized, and now it's up to the government to put a regulatory body in place, whether they call it a cannabis board, a cannabis commission, cannabis regulatory coalition, whatever they call their agency that's going to be responsible for regulating the legal market. It's up to them to decide what are going to be the specific policies on how, and the rules around the licensing, who can get them, what are the steps that they have to get them to get a license, what are the fees tied to that, and then if they're going to have a specific program to promote equitable participation or promote equity, and who qualifies for equity. What we saw was a smack in the face of those harmed by the war on drugs when you look at what happened in Connecticut, because the governor flat out said that he did not want for people who have convictions. I think the language was particularly around felony language. I'm not quite sure if it qualifies for misdemeanor. He didn't want them to have the opportunity to pursue licenses. And the argument, which it's difficult when you're in these spaces to hear people make statements and you're just, and for people to embrace it or accept it as if that makes sense. But the argument was that he didn't want wealthy college students who may have been arrested for a possession during college. He didn't want them to be able to tap into the equity program and benefit that way to open up a business. Now, the people that are going to be opening up the businesses in your regular path that you have structured are wealthy people. And the people who have been traditionally harmed by the war on drugs tend to be the ones with the records, they have a large representation in that pool. And so to say that you don't want them to have ownership and to use that as the rationale doesn't make sense. Because if that's the case, if you don't want wealthy kids who made some stupid decision to engage in the plan and got caught while in college, you don't want their families to benefit from this, then perhaps your approach should look at how are you allowing multi-state operators into your state. But that's not my state. Again, here, what the goal with the Cannabis Equity Minutes, our time together, is to get folks to think about the decisions that people who are in key positions are making. And it's not just the government. I want to make that a quick clarification. I think every individual, every business, every corporation, every organization has a role to play when it comes to this industry. And they also have a role to play when it comes to ensuring that there is equity, and particularly ensuring that those who have been harmed the most, because this was an unjust measure, the whole element of prohibition with the war on drugs, the war targeting Black and brown communities, or Black communities, if you go back to 50 years ago when it was orchestrated, that all of these elements combined are tied to this plant. So now to see our government, the very government that orchestrated this terrorist act against individuals, against communities, simply because of their skin color, and leveraged their participation of this plant to do so, to see them come full circle and say, oh, well, we want to benefit monetarily, where we realize that cannabis is not as bad as we said it was. Black and brown folks have been harmed ridiculously by this. The war on drugs has been more devastating than anything. Oops, we made a mistake, we need to do something right. Well, doing something right by the people you've harmed means you're including them in the opportunities that are now going to be available to the public through legal measures. And so if we don't see an avenue for that, then you are disingenuous at best, and that's evil. I mean, to think of I can't even think of a PC way of saying it. I mean, it's part of the track record of our country to push these injustices against the people, and legislate it, put it in policy, accept it as regular and normal habits of practice. So let's bring this home to Massachusetts, because in Massachusetts, the landscape is slightly different. We do allow avenues for people who have records to enter into this industry. But who do we see the target being? Well, when you go to the Cannabis Control Commission's website, they said that their measure of success for equity is particularly around minority, women, and veterans, the number of the ownership of those businesses. Now, without taking in consideration the industry that we're talking about, when you talk about equity, those are good metrics. But to say that in the context of social equity, in the context of legacy equity, in the context of doing right by the citizens of Massachusetts who have been harmed the most by the war on drugs, that is an injustice, and blatantly before our community. And I don't think the folks in regular citizens really catch that, right? They're saying that they're going to measure success by, the diversity of who can get ownership in the licensing and own businesses. And that's important. But the misconception becomes, well, what about the people who have been harmed the most by the war on drugs? Those are the ones that you said were going to go first. When we had the Black and Latino caucus reach out to the legislative body and join forces with the Joint Committee on Cannabis Policy back in 2017, and they were talking about ensuring that those who have been harmed the most are able to participate. This is the conversation. This was the spirit in which the equity measures were put together and put in place, and that's the messaging that went out to the public. Fast forward 5 years later, that's not what we see happening. But that doesn't change the fact it's important. I want to underscore that. It doesn't change the fact that diversity in that aspect is important. What I do want to highlight is something that I put out when I talked about in the Marijuana Massachusetts Social Equity Report. And I said some of the things that the commission needs to be very cognizant of if they want to get social equity right in Massachusetts and be a leader in this space. And so if you look, I think it was around recommendation 4, where I talked about the need to look at the collateral consequences tied to being a victim, if you will, of the war on drugs, being a target of the war on drugs, and the impact that that's had if you were arrested, and then furthermore, if you had a conviction on your record, and all of the impact that entails. I do talk about that in detail, and it's alarming when I look across the country, when I look across the state, and I see the conversation shifting from language about those who have been harmed by the war on drugs to language about minority participation, women participation, veteran participation. And make no mistake, I recognize I am a woman saying this. I recognize that as a Black woman, I am considered a minority saying this. However, it's not lost on me that when they use the term minority, as opposed to using the terms Black or brown, which are the terms that they have us checking off on the census boxes and so forth, it's not lost on me that it's more inclusive than those who have been traditionally harmed the most. It's not lost on me when they say women or when they say veterans, that they're including white people in this space. It's not lost on me at all. And I hope it's not lost on the public either, because if the true intention was to really target this population that not only had been marginalized, because the people who have been harmed the most fall into these categories, but you can check off these categories. You could check all 3 of them off and not fall under the category of the population of people who've been harmed the most by the war on drugs. I think about some of the businesses that have opened up local to where I am here on the South Shore. We have a Black woman-owned business, but then not too far away from her, we have another minority-owned business, a woman-owned business. Now, again, in terms of equity, marginalized groups, any industry, these types of numbers, great to push forward. But when we look at the charge for reaching those who have been harmed the most, we missed the mark. And to see the Cannabis Control Commission push language to say that their metrics for success is going to be ownership for minority groups and completely disregard the very population that we said we really wanted to see equitable participation from, is an example of how they move the goalpost and the public doesn't catch it. And this is a trend that's taking hold across the country. While folks are celebrating legalization, they're celebrating, hey, we're at our 19th state, more than half the American population, if you factor in the each of these states' populations, more than half of them now will be able to have access to legal cannabis. We're looking at an industry by 2025. I think the projection is upwards of $100 billion for this country tied to cannabis. And you want to tell me that there are people who are still left out of this industry and we have done nothing for them? In Massachusetts, the Joint Committee on Cannabis Policy had another meeting, so they've been meeting over the last 2 months, the last several weeks, talking about different proposals, different bill proposals, and receiving public input on what they should look at in terms of drafting. And so today's topic was on medical marijuana and some of the measures around them that are of interest perhaps to people who are concerned about equity in this space. Medical marijuana as a whole is an equity issue. Why? Because you do not see access to medical cannabis in Black and brown communities. You do not even see the communication to members of the communities as this plant being an alternative for the traditional medications that they are receiving, dealing with things like arthritis or pain and so forth. You don't even see that communication being an option in these communities. So just on that basic level of access, medical marijuana has a huge issue when it comes to equity. Now, looking at it from the lens of equitable participation, when it comes to ownership in Massachusetts, and this is something that we talked about in the Massachusetts Social Equity Report. We've written to the commission about this in the past when they were during their various regulation sessions, and asked that they look at their policies that they have in place for equity, some of the programming that they have for their equity participants, and apply that to medical marijuana, to the licensees for the medical in the medical space, because they regulate both. And so any equity program that they are overseeing should apply across the board, because we're talking about access to the plant. We're talking about a plant that it didn't matter how you were accessing it. A lot of the times, Black people, you hear them say that, I smoke a joint, it relaxes me. There is scientific research and then anecdotal experience to back it that supports the fact that this plant serves a purpose when it comes to dealing with trauma. And we know the trauma tied to the disproportionate and the dehumanizing impact that prohibition and enforcement of prohibition, and even to this day, the continued actions around law enforcement tied to cannabis, that the trauma that it has, the legacy trauma. And what do I mean by legacy trauma? It didn't just affect that individual and perhaps their significant other or something. It had legacy impacts. It affects their parents, it affects their children, it affects their entire community. Because they chose to participate with that. And even outside of, if you weren't arrested for cannabis, even if you weren't in a community that has been deemed disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, you still have been impacted by the trauma tied to it. See, what the war on drugs did, particularly the campaign that was orchestrated against our Black skin, was it created a stigma and the stigma crossed all racial lines, right? It didn't matter if you were black or brown. It didn't matter if you were white, red, blue, whatever color. It didn't matter what your socioeconomic status was. There was a stigma for participating with the plant, using the plant, selling the plant. I mean, if you sold the plant, you were a drug lord. That's the perception when it came to Black people who participated in this plant. Now, for white folks, it became a matter of, well, how much weight did you have? Was it a possession charge or a distribution charge? When you were distributing, to what scale? Were you high up on the rank? All of these details and nuanced aspects come to play in a person's judgment, if you will, when it's white folks' participation with the plant. But when we talk about Black folks, and where does the stigma comes from? Everything from the way the laws are enforced, right? That creates a stigma. It creates a stigma for everyone who's in that legal pipeline. Everyone from the DA to the prosecutors to the defenders, whether they are public defenders, private defenders, to the jury, all of them. In just the way when you look at how charges are doled out, the judges, when you look at how convictions are determined, when you look at even just the reasons for arrest and all of the charges that are tied to that arrest, you see a disparity. The research that is out there for that says it time and time again, that the disparity exists across racial lines. So when you could look at two individuals, the only difference between them being their race, their skin color, and their pathway through the legal system is significantly different, with the Black or brown person having a more a deeper, more aggressive, more punitive experience with the legal system than their white counterpart, who perhaps engaged in the same or similar infraction. So all of that to say, I want to keep this constantly at the forefront. And despite the fact that I know, I talk to some folks who trek with me regularly, and there are others who, although I do not speak to you directly, I recognize the influence and the impact that just hearing this perspective can have in your seats of power, in your seats of decision making, whether you're in an organization that's trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we support those harmed the most by the war on drugs? Because just supporting, broad spectrum equity programs, or the broad picture that's presented to the public as social equity, we can miss the mark indirectly. And so what I want to push the community to do is really hone in and be sure that when you say you're going to do something, that the decisions that you make align with the outcome that you're intending. And so, certain decisions, whether you are government officials, in Massachusetts and in a lot of these states, we see this happening in New York with the different counties now. In Massachusetts, the different towns have the option to decide not only if where the zoning rules in terms of where cannabis will be, operations will be allowed to exist, but also they can erect other policies around what that looks like in their state, in their town, particularly if they're going to have an equity program in their town. And although I think this is a missed opportunity at the state level from our regulatory body in terms of really putting the pressure on municipalities to erect their own equity programs that align, not that go against, but that align with what the state not only has in place, but what the state mandate is. Again, I think it's a missed opportunity, but there are some municipalities in Massachusetts, towns here, that have taken it upon themselves to say, hey, we're going to do equity. Equity is important to us. We want to have equity first. But then you go look at the measures that they have in place, and you're like, how does that help equity? And you can always determine if your decisions are impactful by the outcome. And if the outcome is not what you intended it to be, do you change your goal or do you change the decisions? And hopefully you don't change the goal. Hopefully the goal always continues to be to keep those who have been harmed by the war on drugs at the forefront in terms of how do we foster and create avenues for access to this industry at all levels for them? And then also, what decisions did we make and how do we adjust these decisions to ensure that the outcome we have is going to meet that charge, right? Not to diminish the charge ultimately is what I'm saying here. So going back to the data, I didn't highlight here in Massachusetts, we do have 253 businesses that are operational now. I think for the last couple of sessions, our time together, we've had the same number. We had not had any businesses get to the point of operation. And I think what's really even more exciting is of those 3 new businesses that are operational here in Massachusetts, 2 of them are social equity businesses, particularly around the new delivery license that came out. They are at the courier level. So if you are tracking in Massachusetts, we have 2 levels of delivery licenses. You can do a courier style where you pick up from a retailer and you deliver it to the home of a customer. And then we also have what's called the wholesale license type, where you can actually have a storage space, access cannabis directly from at a wholesale pricing and wholesale agreements from cultivators and product manufacturers directly. And then from there, you can deliver, you can create your own shell, if you will, and then deliver to customers. So it is exciting to see that we have more operations opening up in Massachusetts, and we have 2 social equity participants who have been able to open up their delivery businesses. I think we're still at 8 out of 10 businesses here in Massachusetts are white-owned, or at least, and I think when you look at the level of licensee, I think it's closer to 9. But we're making headway. What I do hope the commission will look to see, and we'll see more push, whether it's at the legislative level and at the commission level, both wherever we see the policy decision or the legislative decision being made, we see that they embrace this commitment to equity across licenses and do not pigeonhole us to delivery. You know, I go back, it goes back to the same idea of we celebrate legalization because those who are able to capitalize on it, great, particularly those in communities and populations that have been traditionally harmed, marginalized, left out, targeted by the war on drugs. We celebrate that, but it's not lost, and we do not lose focus on the fact that there are still people who are being arrested for this, that it is still considered a Schedule I drug, which means at any time the federal government can intervene, and disproportionately we see that intervention happening against Black and brown people. It's not lost on the fact that the greatest thing that the greatest equity measure that people are championing is this idea of expungement, which completely misses the mark in when it comes to ameliorating for the effects for the war on drugs. So all of these things, we want to constantly bring them to the forefront. So you're going to hear me bring it up. I think the policy committee did hear certain proposals. Again, these are things that we've talked about when it comes to the medical marijuana space. Everything we are arguing and pushing for in the legal space, we want that legal space to not just pertain to adult use. We want to see it pertain also to the medical space as well. So when you talk about ownership, and if that means we separate out the licenses, because currently in Massachusetts, if you're going for a medical license, it's considered a vertical integration license. You cannot just open up a medical cultivation site. You have to have the capital in place to open up and execute on medical and, a cultivation and a dispensary, retailing, selling to patients. I don't want to say the word retail because that's the language we use for the recreational, or what we call adult use market. So we want to see the same metrics, and by separating out that vertical integration, no longer making it a requirement to pursue medical license, and an individual or a company or group of individuals, a business can pursue just one aspect of that in the medical space, it makes it more accessible. And then again, if we want to do all of this, and it doesn't matter what market we're talking about. And again, going back to the fact that everyone tied to this industry has a role to play, not just the government, not just the corporate responsibility for these major operators and any businesses that are erecting businesses, but also the organizations tied to that, looking at, well, how do we account for the people who we recognize as being harmed the most, and there's no avenue for access because their record is such that they don't qualify for employment. That was part of the issue, right? When people want to champion expungement. And the workaround for a lot of these people is that they had to find creative ways to make income to support their family. So we see a lot of them turning to business ownership. But then in a lot of markets across the country, you need a license, including here in Massachusetts. You need a license to open up a cannabis business. And so by having that regulatory aspect in place, we preclude anybody who has a significant record tied to cannabis, and that record is not able to be expunged, or it's not considered a minor misdemeanor. And so now we're still dealing with the issue of never addressing the harm that was created. Perhaps people don't understand, you get arrested for your use of a plant. Perhaps you had a lot of it because you use it a lot. And the legal system, law enforcement said, oh, this was intent to sell. So now you're hit with a distribution charge. You never said that you were selling. There was no evidence other than the quantity of what you had. And quantity is relative, right? I sit in a mom canna group, and some of the moms talk about the fact that they smoke at least, a blunt or two a day. How much they put in that's a whole different matter. And then there's some that say, a joint will last them a whole week. So quantity is quite relative again. And, depending on the level of trauma, if this is your mechanism for dealing with stress and trauma, then of course your use is going to be high. But back to the scenario that I was describing, you have an individual that has a significant amount of possession. They interact with law enforcement at the level of police officers. And now police officers, they're the first gatekeepers in terms of deciding what your charges are going to be. And we see disparity there. We see, where some may just be charged for possession. Others are charged for possession, intent to distribute, and intent to distribute at a large quantity. Then you get before the judge, and you're dealing with a public defender, perhaps. And the public defender is not even aware of what your particular case is, because they're overloaded. And so they're pushing for you to take a deal, a plea deal, and you're not in the wrong, or perhaps you believe you're not in the wrong, or you don't think that you're going to get significant time for this. And then you go before the judge, and they look at the letter of the law, they look at the charges that have been brought before you, between what the records of the police officer and what the DA decided that they're going to charge you with. And they said, oh, well, you're going to get, you deserve some time for this according to the law, because that's what judges are in place to do. And they get to determine how long that time is going to be, or what that time looks like. Is it going to be time served behind prison, or is it going to be time served in a class? So oftentimes we hear our white counterparts were doled out a charge, convicted of the charge, but then their conviction resulted in they having to take a class or enter into some type of rehabilitation program. And you may feel as though, well, that's still punishment. That's what the judge determined. And you're right. One of the quote unquote upside to that type of punishment is that you get to be reunited with your family, as opposed to an individual with a similar charge, and their sentence is to go into prison. Now, they may go to prison just for a year, as opposed to maybe 9 years or 10 years, or et cetera. They may go to prison for just for a year. But I don't think the public, who may not be tied to may not have a personal experience with our criminal justice system, I don't think they realize, well, if you go to prison for a year and something happens in that prison, and you are unjustly, because once you enter into prison, justice takes on a different toll, right? You no longer have the same level of rights. A lot of those are lost, but you are unjustly charged with a crime while you're in prison, a place that you should not have been in the first place. You are exposed to levels of criminality that you were not that you would not have been exposed to in the first place had the system not targeted you for your participation in the plant. So now you get charged with another crime while you're in jail, and you have to go before the judge, and then another. It's a whole cyclical round. And so your time, you're not only your time, but your tie to the criminal justice system, the criminal legal system, is much closer and with a much more punitive nature in terms of your relationship. And all of that has consequences that fall back on you. You come out of the system, and you're still tied to the system through probation. You're still tied to the system because you have a record now that precludes you from housing, employment, schooling, even ownership of certain types of businesses because of the licenses tied to it. Then there's the trauma. You do not have access to care that you would need. We're still working on even recognition in terms of the mental health space for people to have access to cannabis, and the potential that it can serve in helping people heal from their trauma, let alone the physical pain, right? So, all of these issues are things that when we have Black folks who do get into positions, when we have allies who do get into positions to make a difference, the charge is for you to be mindful of this. You get on with a major corporation that is probably in the top tier in the country because they realize after everything that happened with over the last several months that, oh wow, our organization, our leadership isn't diverse. So they bring you on in the spirit of diversity. They bring you on, and perhaps it was under the guise of saying, hey, we want to be more socially responsible. We want our actions to actually have an impact. We want to positively impact our communities. They tap you for this. And I think there's more of us that needs to at least bring the message and say, hey, look, I know I'm here for a job. This is what the job said. If we're going to do the job right, we have to take some of these bold measures. Or you turn a blind eye because you have a family to feed. Either way, I don't make the judgment. That's not my place to make the judgment. The call that I'm here to do is to really get you to think about it and recognize if each of us exercises and leverage the position that we are in to truly hit and reach the marginalized population that has been harmed through the orchestrated war against Black and brown people in this industry, we will see an industry that's going to start to look like the change that we hope to see. We're not going to see the perpetuation of business as usual. One of the interesting things in Massachusetts, and I harped on it in the social equity report, I talked about it to the commission in various capacities and facets. I brought it up on this platform numerous times, is this idea of communities of disproportionate impact. And if you think that when they say that's going to reach the people who have been harmed the most by the war on drugs, you are not fully aware of what is happening. It's a misconception. In the past, I've given examples as to how the commission identified communities that have been disproportionately impacted, that we would have communities like Lawrence. Lawrence in Massachusetts is a majority, they call it majority minority community. What does that mean? The majority of the population is the majority of the world, reflects the majority of the world's population. It's Black and brown people, particularly brown folks, but Black and brown people make up that population. And so a combination of the way that town, that city captured their data, and the way when you compare to white counterparts, you're not going to see as huge a disparity. So those two measures, the result was that they were not considered a community that's been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, which was a grave injustice when you look at the history, right? But then you had other communities that the orchestration against Black and brown people didn't really happen at their doorsteps. It happened maybe in their towns, perhaps when Black and brown people were in their towns because they were policed more, they were arrested more, and so you see that disparity. And I gave the example of Braintree and Abington and so forth. And so you have people who live in these towns who've never had to deal with the war on drugs in any capacity per se, yet they're able to benefit from our social equity program. So again, it's unintended consequence, some may say, or an intended consequence for those who don't really care to reach the intended target in this capacity. They don't have a problem reaching the intended target when it comes to the prohibition aspect and enforcement of the laws, right? But when it comes to righting the wrongs, if you will, when it comes to ameliorating and addressing the harms that were enacted, all of a sudden it becomes the target is nebulous. We use terms like minorities, we use terms like communities, as opposed to saying, hey, let's talk about the Black and brown population, because that's who was targeted. So after all that is said and done, I took it upon myself, because the commission, they did issue a report, and then they do have a working group that's looking at how do they determine disproportionately impacted communities, and should they be thinking of it in other ways, which they absolutely need to. Why? So I went back and I looked at the neighborhood, one of the neighborhoods I grew up in the city of Boston. So we're talking about the 80s and the 90s, right? And that census tract is on the Cannabis Controls Area of Disproportionate Impact. And I'm like, okay, cool. However, I would not qualify because I grew up there in the 80s and 90s. I wouldn't qualify because it's been 20 years since I lived in that neighborhood. And for a lot of reasons, we moved out of the neighborhood. We left and had to, my family, my parents, wanted to raise their children elsewhere. My mother, she got robbed when she was pregnant with me. And so, yes, they were definitely not trying to stay there when they were able to move. It did take them about 10, 11 years. Way more details than you needed to know. But the point is, that neighborhood is on the census tract for the commission for what's considered a disproportionately area that's been impacted by the war on drugs. The part that's missing is, like I said, one, me and people who look like me, and people who, like my family and our neighbors who lived there 20, 30 years ago, no longer live there. So I don't qualify. And then when I go back to that community, when I go back to the streets in those neighborhoods, it doesn't look the same. So the people who now qualify because they've lived there for the last 5 years or so, they don't look like the ones who've been targeted the most by the war on drugs. That neighborhood isn't even policed the same, because I went up and down the street, made it all the way to the train station, and didn't see a police officer or a vehicle, anything in that matter. So, if we're not going to be bold and committed to addressing the specific populations, we're going to miss the mark. And unfortunately, it's going to be the very people who we said we wanted to help, right? Those who have been harmed the most, that phrase, the most, they're going to be the ones who are going to be the most disenfranchised by these equity programs. They're going to be the ones that are most hedged by the people who are able to capitalize on the way these equity programs are being structured and who's getting access to it. So I say all that to say, let's make sure that we're not losing that conversation, make sure we're not losing that focus, and we hold ourselves accountable. I did not want to miss a couple of other things I wanted to highlight with Massachusetts earlier this week. Today is Tuesday, right? So yesterday, Boston Business Journal, I think, came out with an article about one of the major operators in the country, and their filings. So they report out their filings to the investors and also to the SEC, and they say, you know, what they have and the businesses that they owned. And the commission recently approved a change in ownership with this company, and this company is acquiring, or they now have control of, 3 other fairly large entities who all have a presence here in Massachusetts, who all hold licenses to certain capacities at certain levels, if not are operational. And you know, you have to ask yourself, well, did the commission intentionally just choose to not address this, or was it that they weren't aware? And which means, okay, the investigative team, they need to kind of have them take these things into consideration. I don't know what their protocol is for how they look at businesses, but when I looked at the business, and just on their website alone, because they have to give this, they need to be marketable to investors, right? And so when you look on the website alone, and they're turning around telling their investors that the business, I think, is Gotham. You know, I'm not saying anything that is any type of hot topic. You know, this is in the news, but for folks who may have missed it or don't have access to that, to the Business Journal, I think it's the Gotham Green Partners. Green is in a lot of names, so don't hold me to it. And they have equity stake in some key businesses that also have a strong footprint in Massachusetts, particularly, you know, MedMen, Forefront, Ianthus, and you're just like, wait a minute, we do have a 3-cap rule here in Massachusetts, and these folks, they've named 3 individual entities, and each of these individuals entities are maximizing their pursuit of licenses here, and the cap tied to that. So how is that not a violation, and what is the ramification for that? Is it just going to be a fee? Why I bring this up? Because when we talk about the suitability review of businesses in Massachusetts, the agency that's regulating has made it known that they are going to investigate businesses. They made it known to me because I guess, you know, I am going to be gung-ho and investigate businesses and say, hey, these businesses are violating the law. This is what the law said. And these businesses have leveraged their position, and they have fleeced the community, however you want to take it. And they've told me that because I've done that, they're going to question my suitability to have a license. But I'm sitting here looking at these major operators who constantly are in the news for violations, and I didn't violate any laws. And in fact, I was actually just saying, hey, how come we're not holding these people to the law? And I'm being, quote unquote, charged. Well, I haven't been charged, but I guess threatened, if you will, with perhaps a suitability review, which would exclude me, let me be clear, exclude me from being able to pursue a license in Massachusetts. Now, I have no record. I've never done anything tied to the plan or anything else. I hold other licenses in Massachusetts. So in terms of violations there isn't anything to question my suitability, other than wanting to hold entities accountable for what they're saying and what they're doing. And it's not unique to the cannabis industry. My track record expands into other industries that I have been a part of, and that I am deeply committed to seeing equity in these places as well, because it's the same type of systemic white supremacy taking hold and having the impact where we see continually marginalized groups, and it's consistently been Black and brown people who are bearing the brunt of that marginalization and the negative impact of that. So back to these businesses who you question their suitability to operate in Massachusetts, where Massachusetts has consistently since day one said they're not tolerating any business that's going to violate the cap that they have in place. They want to this is how we're going to regulate our industry. So what is that consequence? Perhaps we should have them take a greater responsibility in our markets, in our industry. You know, looking at some of their positive impact plans, for the amount that they are leveraging and benefiting from our residents, from our communities, they definitely are not giving back to that measure. And that's something that I have consistently pushed for. Why wouldn't we say that's how people are taxed? So why wouldn't we, and particularly in this industry, because in this industry, you don't, as it stands right now, you don't get all the write-offs that other businesses have in other industries. You don't get to enjoy that. Not yet anyways. So why wouldn't we say, as part of the requirement, it's a policy that we have in place to positively impact the community. So we should have something that it says you need to do it commensurate with your level of the revenue that you're generating. And it's not unfounded, and it's not out of their scope, meaning it's not going to hurt them in a way that would crush their business. I'm not their chief financial officer, right? So I'm not in the space to say, oh, well, your business won't crumble, because I don't know what all the other decisions that you're making. However, I know if the expectation is set at the forefront, the way for a positive impact that's going to be commensurate with your the level of revenue you're generating from our markets, if that's set at the forefront, at the onset, the same way the tax expectation is, then the businesses will plan accordingly to ensure that they are generating revenues to meet the demands that and the goals that they have for their particular business. So I'll wrap up that piece and watch how it unfolds, what the commission's decision is. Do they do an investigation of these businesses, and then what the decision is around how they're going to hold them accountable? Is it simply going to be fines, which tend to run in the range of $200,000 to $350,000 at this point when you look over the track record of certain infractions and enforcement actions that the commission has taken? Right. So is it going to be something similar to that, or are we going to see something greater? Is it going to be per business? I'm not putting any ideas out there. If I were to put an idea out there, it would be, hey, let's see them sponsor. Maybe that's the word, because I think people get tripped up when I say pair. Let's see them sponsor equity program participants, economic empowerment certificate holder businesses, where the money that they set aside, that's what it goes to. The volunteer hours that they have, the seminar trainings that they said that they're going to put in place, that they reformat them so that it's in a way that they are able to facilitate training, support, direct support that is tailored to the needs of the economic empowerment certificate holder or entrepreneurial track social equity participant. Or even better, how about they turn over that host community agreement that they're just holding on to, or that they might have to turn over? How about they turn that over to and donate that to an equity applicant? And when I say donate, it's not lost on me that certain municipalities took the time to review the potential business that would be there, and they had their own metrics for how they the business plans that they evaluated. But well-capitalized businesses, very few have come into the Massachusetts market and received pushback from the local community to participate in secure a host community agreement. There have been some. There are lawsuits tied to them, but there haven't been many. On that note of lawsuit, I think the economic empowerment certificate holders, I remind that group that we do have legislative standing, and to that point, the judiciary body has made statements to question, well, why is it that we have not gotten that representation? Perhaps it's because the legal representation and the way the industry is structured, we have not seen law firms take that commitment to equity and see justice in that capacity. And perhaps we may see that. Perhaps we may see law firms who have a commitment to equity across the board, that they will reach out and identify ways to assist the economic empowerment certificate holders who were duped with the idea that they were going to get priority in this industry, and that was taken away. Perhaps we'll see that assistance being provided and support, and not just to say it again, similarly on a commensurate level. You're a top law firm, maybe you'll do it in a top way, not just pick and choose one or two licensees pursuing a small license, but you'll look at it and say, hey, what can I do for this industry, on a social responsible level. I know that'll reach the ears that it needs to reach. You can always reach out to me directly. I'm happy to talk about proposals and solutions that, I push the PIES program, but I've definitely talked about other ways of drafting proposals that can get at reaching those who are missing, that are falling through the cracks because the policy decisions, the practice decisions, business practice decisions that we see happening really aren't catching the very people who've been harmed by the war on drugs. And so I guess that'll be the wrap up for this evening. I guess this has been my message and my episode, my time with you all, really committed to those who have been harmed the most, what that means. Oh, and back to the Joint Cannabis Committee group that met today. The other piece that I haven't seen much of is the idea of businesses sponsoring lobbyists that will go on behalf of those who've been harmed the most by the war on drugs, and research and really listen to the messaging so that the decision makers over there on Capitol Hill are really getting a sense, okay, or not just Capitol Hill, even in local communities, municipalities, as they're making their decisions, they're really getting a truer sense as to what will make a difference. Or is this, or the people that we're hearing from are people who have a vested interest, a direct vested interest in benefiting directly or indirectly from a certain policy decision, and at the expense of a greater community, and so we don't see businesses sponsoring lobbyists, sponsoring organizations to have the bandwidth. One of the things that I've mentioned, this is the call out. If you want to work with, join in the work that I'm doing in terms of calling attention to equity, there are different ways to join in, whether it is financially or whether it is sweat equity. That those opportunities exist, and there's a lot of things that we can lift and push forward. One of them being getting before these decision makers and bringing the voice of those who have been marginalized. I can call on the regulatory body, as much as possible. However, we all play a role in that. And if you recognize you have an avenue in a lane and you'd like to leverage it to maximize that, reach out. You can reach out to me on any of the platforms that you are watching this on. And the handle Mass Mother Mary is existing on most social media platforms and also on a Gmail handle, or you can do info@massmothermary.com and just highlight the Cannabis Equity Minutes and let me know that that's what you're interested in doing. To that end, we'll wrap up, and I will see you on Friday. Thank you to those of you that have joined. See you next time. Good evening, everyone.